Hey everyone, this is Mo from Smart Training 365. Welcome to the channel. Today I'm talking with Dr. Samuel Buckner. Samuel is an exercise scientist and the director of the Muscle Physiology Lab at the University of South Florida. He specializes in resistance training, muscle hypertrophy, and exercise physiology, with a particular focus on how muscles grow and the effectiveness of methods like low load resistance training and blood flow restriction. His neutral, evidence-based approach to exercise science makes him one of my go-to sources for understanding how to train effectively. Samuel, it's great to have you here today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Just before we start, do all researchers has to do backflips, handstands, and things like that to be able to qualify as researchers?
um, maybe it gets you extra PhD points, right?
Yeah,
No,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's
PhD, of
it's
course.
it's something that I've always enjoyed in my free time. I admittedly I don't do it as much as I used to. I just haven't had the time, and as you go through life, there's different periods where you have more time to dedicate to training and other periods where there's less time. But it's something I always revisit every year and just to see how my body responds to trying to go upside down, trying to flip, trying to handstand, whatever it might be.
But how did it start? Like, were you a gymnast before, or like?
Yeah, I was a gymnast, and during my bachelor's degree, I was getting more interested in the gym, like resistance training, as opposed to gymnastics. And I kind of quit gymnastics and I started to do more strength gymnastics. So, like challenging myself, how many handstand push-ups can I do? And I started to do something called 90-degree push-ups, which I thought I had invented at the time because it's like a handstand, you lower your legs. And I looked online and I
Bruce Lee.
realized it was a thing. And then I started training for the world record of 90-degree push-ups, which I got. I got the world record in 2013 or 2014. I recorded it, I submitted it to Guinness, and I never like I had to schedule a thing with someone to come out and do it, and I never like made it official. But I still tell people at one point I had a world record for something, so I think that's kind of cool.
That's very cool. Absolutely. So I'm gonna ask you a question that maybe nobody asked you before, which is, how do muscle grow?
That's a great question. And I think a question a lot of people have when you read a study and the study says there was muscle growth, the assumption that I think most of us have are that the contractile aspects of the muscle have increased, meaning that we've added sarcomeres, we've added contractile proteins of actin and myosin. So hypertrophy or muscle growth is the addition of these contractile elements, but also the expansion of the non-contractile elements, the sarcoplasm. And I think that became popular probably three to 5 years ago. People started talking a lot more about sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is kind of the support system around the contractile aspect, and then myofibrillar hypertrophy, which is proteins that are associated with the myofiber, and the myofiber is kind of when you just keep zooming into muscle, you get to the myofibers, which produce force. They're made out of sarcomeres. And we're basically adding actin and myosin protein, but expanding those other aspects as well. In research, when we say there's muscle growth, oftentimes what we're actually measuring is muscle thickness, for example, measured by ultrasound. So, meaning I look at your muscle with ultrasound, I can measure from the muscle fat interface down to the muscle bone interface, and I can track that change across time. Now, when muscle thickness increases, the assumption is there's been an increase at the fiber level that's associated with the contractile proteins in that muscle. And different labs measure it different ways. There's some labs that measure cross-sectional area, which just take a different view of the muscle and quantify it a little bit differently. Some labs will measure muscle growth at the fiber level by looking at changes in fiber cross-sectional area. So they actually will extract tissue samples and look at the fibers and look at the cross-sectional area of the actual fibers. Some studies, it's probably less common, will look at protein content within the muscle. So changes in the ratio of actin to myosin and these sorts of things in response to training. But in general, most people consider hypertrophy radial growth, an increase in the size of those fibers, which is then reflected at the whole muscle level.
So are these two kinds of hypertrophy, can you can target one over the other, or it's not really possible? And if it's possible, it's going to be very thin that you cannot really say that you're going to work toward a specific myofibril hypertrophy or
Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
Yeah, so I think there's some different schools of thought regarding this. And, I tend to think that hypertrophy is hypertrophy. And if your muscle gets bigger, the sarcoplasm essentially supports the myofibrillar portion. So it stores the calcium, for example. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum in particular releases calcium that allows your muscle to contract. So my belief is that they increase in proportion. But there was a study that came out, I want to say maybe 2016 or 2017, that looked at sarcoplasmic hypertrophy to very high volume training. And what they found in that study is that it looked like components of the sarcoplasm had increased in quantity in response to this really high volume training program. But different people, from what I've determined from looking online, listening to different folks speak, have different interpretations of that particular paper. In that paper, they actually took a subset of their sample. So the purpose of the paper was to look at like whey protein or something. And the study at large, when they had their full sample, did very high volume training and they had no muscle growth. The authors then took the people at the high end of growth. So overall, the mean change in muscle size was non-significant. They didn't grow. They then took the people that they identified as, quote, responders to the training, and they looked at the hypertrophy and the components of the hypertrophy and determined that there was sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So it's like a subset of their sample maybe saw it, but a lot of people might say this part of their sample might just be the upper error of their measurement, right? So you think you're analyzing something meaningful, maybe you are, but it's also possible that that study in and of itself needs replication just because it's a subset of a larger sample that had no muscle growth from high volume training. Now, to your question, can you train differently to stimulate either sarcoplasmic or myofibrillar hypertrophy? I guess the jury is still out on that one. I couldn't tell you for sure. I could tell you that some people would associate higher volume training with sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. I would say the evidence that they're basing that statement on is fairly weak. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with having that belief, but you need to realize that that belief is rooted in one study that was a subset of a data set that might have seen it. It's interesting and it's curious, right? And maybe it helps some people rationalize why in some studies they get a lot of growth, but they don't get a lot of strength adaptation. So I think that perplexes some folks. But overall, in my mind at least, it just makes sense that if your myofibers experience muscle growth, the sarcoplasm has to increase proportionally to provide the proper support for the muscle function. So I don't think you can necessarily train for one type of hypertrophy over the other, but I'm open to being wrong on that.
Why do we need weight to grow muscle?
So why do we need weight? So like a external, some type of a dumbbell or barbell or these sorts of things.
Yeah, we need resistance. Like why resistance is required to stimulate muscle growth?
Well, I think lifting weights is a very effective way because you have to produce enough internal tension to overcome those weights, right, to activate the signals to tell your muscles to grow. But my research team and my previous research team, we kind of experimented with different methods to try to induce growth. And one of those that you may or may not be aware of was something we called no-load training, where we just produce the internal tension without the external force. Mm-hmm. And the study design seems a little bit silly on the surface. We had people just flex your we told them flex your bicep as hard as you can. So they stood there and they contracted their bicep. They came up, they went down, and we put EMG sensors on their muscle, so they had visual feedback. And it gave us as researchers a little bit of assurance as well to say, okay, they are contracting their muscle really hard. And when they did that, and they did, I think, 4 sets of 20. So there was no weight, but there was internal tension, and there was still some level of fatigue. And we compared growth in one of their arms to their other arm, and their other arm lifted traditional heavy weight for 4 sets to failure, something like that. And across time, we had growth in both groups, and the growth was similar. So an external weight, the way I kind of see it, the external weight is a really efficient way to get internal tension. And that internal tension, that stimulus within the fibers themselves, is what you're trying to get after. External load just happens to be one of the most efficient ways to do that, but you could get internal tension in the absence of that external load. And from what I've seen, it can still stimulate a muscle growth response. You could also lessen the external load. If you lessen the external load, you're just going to end up having to do more repetitions to failure so you can get the same level of activation and fatigue within those fibers across a spectrum of weights, depending on your training preference.
So how do light and heavy weights contribute to muscle growth differently?
Yeah. So I think I've seen a lot of discussion around this topic lately. From my perspective, there's a wide range of training loads that seem to be capable of inducing skeletal muscle growth. And the lightest I've ever tried to go in the research lab was 15% of 1RM in a bicep curl, and that was just too light. What we basically found was, part of lifting, when you lift a weight, you're disturbing the blood flow, right? So the mechanical contraction and squeezing of the muscle disturbs blood flow. And I think that's one of the reasons that you're able to fatigue across an exercise set. You're causing that disturbance. So 15% in the upper body was too light. However, 15% in the lower body and a knee extension did induce skeletal muscle growth. But in general, I would say loads as low as 30% had been pretty consistently effective, and then up to 70-80%, depending on the study and the exercises they use in that study, seem to be capable of inducing muscle growth. And I always kind of think of it as like this spectrum, right? When you lift a weight, you're activating muscle fibers. So let's say you lift a 30-pound dumbbell, and let's just pretend for this example, you have 10 motor units in your bicep. Well, to lift that 30-pound dumbbell, maybe you need 6 or 7 of those motor units. And as they become fatigued, you're going to activate the other motor units. Mm-hmm. So when you lift 12 reps to failure, you've sufficiently activated and fatigued the fibers involved in that movement. Now, if you picked a 10-pound dumbbell instead of the 30-pound dumbbell, when you do that curl, you're now just recruiting 3 of your motor units instead of 7. But if you keep doing repetitions, those 3 motor units are going to become fatigued, and you're going to activate 3 other motor units. So maybe what took you 12 reps before is now going to take you 25 reps, maybe 30 reps. But you're reaching that same endpoint of activating and fatiguing the fibers involved in that movement, which seems to be the important stimulus to induce muscle growth.
So we often hear the advice of control the weight you're lifting. So if you intentionally move a light resistance slowly, can it stimulate the same muscle growth as using a heavier weight where the speed of the movement is naturally dictated by the weight?
Okay. So moving a lightweight more slowly versus lifting a heavy weight at
even though
maybe
you
not.
can lift it fast, but you just choose to lift it slowly versus
Yeah.
when you lift a heavy weight, the speed of the movement will be dictated now by the weight because the weight is heavy.
So like being intentional. You're kind of speaking about the intention.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I thought about this too much, but
Because I see many people, or especially trainers, they give someone a lightweight,
yeah.
and you see that that person he's not doing basically an effort. The weight is light and they are moving it slowly. Versus
Yeah.
like if they move it a little heavier, maybe it will do more something,
Yeah.
But when they use a heavier weight, then now you see like the speed of the movement is more dictated because of the weight, and you can see the effort and facial
Yeah,
expression.
yeah, yeah. I would say that this light weight, if you move it slowly, um, it might ultimately reduce the number of repetitions you have to do just due to time under tension, but then you still have to make sure you're training to that point where you're somewhat close to failure, I think. But if you're just doing a lightweight really slow and replicating the same protocol you do with a heavier weight, I think the end point's going to be a lack of muscle growth or just inferior muscle growth. One of the things that I think paying attention and being intentional about your repetition speed could do, though, is, and one of the things that we use it for in research is just making a movement a little bit more complex and a little bit more difficult. So by controlling speed or being intentional about your speed, in some cases, and maybe not an example you were providing, but in some cases, it can help people fatigue by adding complexity and adding a little bit of time under tension. So I think you can use speed or velocity of movement intentionally in some cases, and it might just maybe you do slow reps and you do 20 reps to failure, or you do fast reps and you do 30 reps to failure. I would suspect, since they're both a similar level of effort, I would suspect that both those protocols would result in similar muscle growth. But if you do slow reps with a load that's insufficient and you're nowhere near failure, I would say you're accomplishing very little, or that would be my that would be what I suspect.
Yeah, that means there's no point in really doing that.
Yeah.
Is it true that whenever an intermediate or advanced person starts a new exercise, they experience new gains? And if yes, how long those gains typically last?
Hmm. So when they begin a new exercise, you're asking.
Yeah, let's
Okay.
say I've been always doing dumbbell chest press,
Yeah.
and then now I'm going to switch to cable chest press.
Yeah.
Is there something that I will gain differently?
I would say it depends. It probably depends on your current variety of movements and how they're kind of currently targeting the musculature. And I think you got a good background, or at least your book does, in biomechanics. So you probably are actually better at this answer than I am. But different exercises target the muscle a little bit differently. And when you look at some studies, a leg press might cause quad growth a little bit different than a leg extension exercise. A seated calf raise might cause different growth in the calves compared to a standing calf raise. One might target the more lateral aspect, one might target the more medial aspect of the muscle. So I think you could get a benefit if you were already neglecting a certain aspect of the muscle, and this new iteration of the exercise is changing how it targets the muscle. But if you're already doing a variety of exercises in your routine that are effectively stressing all aspects of the muscle, then I would suspect the addition of the new exercise just provides you maybe some variety and a different amount of stress on your joints and this sort of thing, so you don't just keep doing the same movement. But in that situation, I would suspect less of a meaningful change in muscle size. One thing you will experience, and I think it's pretty common to experience, is you'll experience a new progression of the load, right? So when you start a new movement, you can see progress in a way that maybe you weren't seeing in your previous lift because it's a little bit novel, and the specificity of that movement is going to cause your strength to increase at a more rapid rate. And some people like to see that progress. It's like motivational. You can see
Yeah.
progress from training session to training session. So people really like that aspect. But I am in favor of variety of movement. I think different movements should be included in a program. And maybe some movements are just a little bit superior for a certain goal regarding muscle growth, right?
Yes.
And for that reason, I think it's great to explore different exercises, different movements, and find ones that really work, and make sure they're in an individual's program.
All right. I agree with you. For motivation, it change in exercise selection is very beneficial because the goal is just to be in the gym and just do the work and work out, better than not working out.
Yeah.
For us, I don't know if you saw in the book, we have the 16 biomechanical factors that we use to
Yeah.
evaluate the efficiency of an exercise. So what we say, like if your goal is hypertrophy and you want to load the muscle optimally, if you move from the most efficient exercise to a less efficient exercise, you're not going to stimulate the muscle optimally. Therefore, the efficiency will be less than that
Yeah.
exercise. So if you're doing it just because you think you're going to get different stimulation, the stimulation is going to be the peripheral muscle recruitment, but
Hmm.
not the main muscle. That means you're
Yeah.
not benefiting the targeted muscle. But if you're doing it for motivation, as we said, or sport specific training, then that's where you can benefit the most from exercise variety,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that, and I haven't read your complete book yet. I've started it. Congrats, by the way. I think
Thank you very
it's
much.
it's a really cool accomplishment.
Thank you.
But I do suspect that, some exercises you might have to replace them with two different exercises if they're not targeting all of the musculature in the way that's necessary,
Right.
right? There might be a movement that you need to replace. Maybe instead of doing how much volume in this movement, you split it between two exercises to make sure that you're still perhaps, stimulating the muscle in the way that you want. But yeah, I don't disagree with the general premise that some exercises are definitely better for muscle growth than others.
What do you use to evaluate the efficiency of a resistance exercise? In your view, what qualifies an exercise as highly efficient?
So I, and it's funny because in research, you're often just limited to what you have access to. And, that's the reality of so much science. When you start a research lab, the school will give you a certain amount of resources and you have to make do. You have to, okay, what study can I design with this? What question can I
Yeah,
answer?
I totally understand.
For me, one of the big things, however, is I want the reason you stop doing that movement to be that the muscle that you're trying to grow can no longer move the weight. And sometimes you'll read research and the research will be looking at biceps muscle growth, but there's no direct bicep work, or people get a little angry about the word direct versus indirect, but the primary muscle is not the bicep. The primary muscle might be the lats or the back, and the bicep is playing a secondary role in that movement. So in my mind, that's probably not the best way to grow your biceps. And I'm even shocked sometimes when these studies will see biceps growth from an exercise like a seated cable row or a lat pull down. So for me, when I'm trying to get a muscle to grow, I try to design a study where the reason the participant can no longer perform a repetition on that exercise is because the muscle that I'm trying to grow can no longer overcome the load. So fatigue of that muscle being the reason you actually fail, I think is one of the big ones for me.
And how long does it take for someone generally to know if a particular exercise is working for them? In general, because I know there are many factors that can, impact, like, genetics, rest, recovery,
Yeah.
nutrition.
That's a good question. I don't know if I've thought about this a whole lot. Um, I one of the things a person would probably want to use to gauge it is the muscle growing, but that probably takes too long, right? You'd finish a couple training blocks before you'd realize that maybe this exercise wasn't the best exercise for me and my biomechanics and these sorts of things. But maybe we could use different, more acute gauges of where you sore the next day, right? If you're doing a hip thrust and you're more sore in your quads than your glutes, then it's not a good exercise for you. Or I have a standing hip thrust in my lab, and some people that try that they're getting more quad and hamstring than they are glute. It's like, okay, well that's not a good exercise for you.
Mm.
Maybe you pay some attention to when you stop the exercise, which muscle you're rubbing, which one is
you feel.
where are you feeling it the most? And I think different people at different training levels have a different mind muscle connection and ability to actually gauge these things. So I think for some folks, it's probably difficult for them to do an exercise and necessarily know where they're feeling it. I think a good indication is sometimes if you get sore 2 days later or a day later, and that's the area you're trying to target, maybe that's some indication
Mm.
that the exercise was targeting the area that you wanted to, or maybe targeting the area that you didn't want it to.
Yeah, like especially the weak link in the chain. Like if you're sometimes you have strong quads and glutes in your squat and you feel your back sore more than your glutes and quads. That means, you know, the erector spinae
Yeah,
is the weak link in the chain. So
yeah,
it does not mean that the squat is a dedicated back erector spinae exercise.
yeah. It could be identifying a weakness. I think that's definitely true. And I think one thing that um, I tell folks is, you know, I think some people feel obligated to do certain movements, and certain movements they don't connect well with,
Yeah.
and they don't enjoy. And I do think in those instances, it's okay to find an exercise that you do connect with, and that you do enjoy. As far as how we approach it in the lab, we try to help people have the correct form and all these sorts of things, and hopefully get them to feel the muscle where they need to. We have the privilege that we have EMG. So, I mean, it's a cool resource that, you could put EMG sensors on the muscle and say, hey, we need to get the signal bigger here. And sometimes that, in science, and I know that's not something that people can normally do in the gym, but it's sometimes neat to get that visual feedback to say, this is what we should be seeing the signal get bigger here, and it's not. And then they kind of find a way to connect with the muscle a little bit better. And that's neat to see sometimes in the lab.
Yeah, I like that. I'll tell you at the end of the video about something that we might be able to do together. But sometimes I remember when I was a trainer uh, that the trainer asked, okay, let's say if you're doing squat or I remember there was an exercise and I totally thought like, well, that cannot fire up because it's not involved. And he was asking her to like mind muscle connection. But physics dictates which muscle is loaded. So you can load a muscle with the physics of the exercise, determine which one. But if you think with your mind that that load is going somewhere else, then you're lying to yourself. That's
Yeah.
why it's not firing, because the resistance is not going to that muscle. So I
Hmm.
think there is understanding also the resistance curve and choosing exercises that stimulate the muscle directly, in my opinion, will yield more results or faster, more efficient results in terms of being efficient with the time and the effort.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with that.
And how much you think genetics, age, recovery ability sometimes, because sometimes it like when someone is genetically blessed and young, even when doing inefficient exercises, those factors mask the inefficiency of an exercise. And that's what we see right now. You see people develop, sometimes they are enhanced, and they use inefficient exercises in terms of muscle loading, but you see big growth. And then they say that the exercise was behind that success. So it's very hard for someone who's trying to find the right advice and information to follow what is really a good exercise. And this is, I think, our mission is to clarify those things for those who are looking for an answer, and guide them so they can try and see the difference. So, in your opinion, like you think genetics plays a big role in masking uh, exercise inefficiency?
I think definitely. Um, I think there's some folks that have to have so much less detail and so much less consideration for the intricacies of what they're doing to elicit a muscle growth response. I think some people can, maybe they're still targeting the muscle, but they're not targeting it as good as they could. But maybe they need less overall contraction and signal, and their muscle's still going to blow up and grow. And then when you add in the anabolics, which sometimes that's at play, right? Not only do they respond to the contraction, but they're responding to the new hormonal environment, and it's just the perfect recipe. So I do think those are poor examples for how we should train. Obviously, it worked for them,
Yeah.
but maybe there's a dozen things that would have worked for that person. Whereas someone that really struggles, maybe they can't recover from lots of volume. And maybe if you did their program, you'd have to just do more volume because rep per rep, maybe you're not getting as much
Hmm.
benefit for the fibers that you're actually trying to grow. So maybe for some individuals, it has to be more intentional. Each rep has to target the muscle that you want to grow and not all the musculature around it to eventually fatigue that muscle so you can grow the one that you're targeting, but you're not targeting it quite as well with that particular exercise. But genetics is a fascinating thing.
Hmm.
And we could put people through the same protocol and you see some people just blow up and the
Hmm.
growth is amazing and it's you're very confident when you look at their muscle pre and post, like wow, that's very clear growth. And you have under other individuals where it looks like they didn't grow, maybe they even look like they lost a little bit of muscle throughout that training block. Why is this happening? And that's just genetics and how people respond differently to the same to the same exact stimulus.
Right. In my opinion, when someone is genetically not blessed, they should really look for the exercise, the most efficient exercises to be able to activate those muscles, and be more efficient with their effort and look to their nutrition and rest and other aspects.
Yeah.
I heard that for non-responders, to be able to become better responders for exercises like cardio can be something that will help them with that, even though like someone, let's say, if he is skinny or, you know, underweight. Is that true?
Um, I I have seen some data that suggests like priming the muscle with a few weeks of cardio might increase the ability to respond. I don't know where the suggestion like the wherever you heard it. I don't know what the maybe the root of the data were.
Hmm.
There's data. And this data is primarily in older individuals that have maybe compromised vasculature. Priming the before they resistance train, priming them with aerobic training increases capillarization, which increases the ability to deliver nutrients to the muscle, which seem to enhance their ability to actually respond to resistance training.
Hmm.
As far as like a responder, non-responder, in younger, healthy individuals, I'm less confident that that's going to do something meaningful, but I think the potential is certainly there. If nutrient availability and partitioning, if that's one of the limiting factors for them to grow, then I could see the rationale as to why cardio might be a good primer. But the data that I'm aware of that at least I can recall
Hmm.
is in older individuals and aerobic exercise helping with nutrient delivery through capillarization, if that makes
Capillary
sense.
density and
Yeah, ribosomes. Yeah,
yeah,
increasing the number
ribosomes.
of ribosomes. Yeah,
Yeah.
and ribosomes are what make the proteins. So if you have more ribosomes, it might increase your ability to upregulate muscle protein synthesis and actually experience hypertrophy.
Right. In studies, we often see two groups compared, for example, one performing a specific quad exercise versus another. Results might show the first group had more success, but how reliable are these findings? Could the outcome be influenced by factors like novelty of the approach or differences in individual genetics, diet recovery, or even the quality of their past training? because it's very hard. Like you have like a tough mission to find people to compare, and then they have like, let's say they must have the same almost genetic response, the
Mhm.
same age, the same quality of past, like how long they've been training. So and also the duration of the study. That's why earlier I asked how long does it take to see a response from a new exercise or something that is done in a specific way, you know, because how long is the study? And then when we find the research, are those research really solid, those findings and results really solid?
Yeah. Um, I think research is really tricky, and I think finding a difference between groups is not easy to do. If you take people and you train them, what I think science is okay at or pretty good at is determining, did this group grow? And it's usually a very small magnitude of growth because most training studies are only 8 to 12 weeks long. So you're trying to capture a very small change
Hmm.
with technology that's just good enough to do it. Now, detecting a difference between groups, I think, is a lot more difficult because one of your interventions has to be strikingly better than the other. And over 8 to 12 weeks, how often is one thing just way, way better than the other? And I think what it comes down to is often one thing causes growth and the other doesn't. And that's why we see differences in studies. But one thing being incrementally better than the other is difficult because, you know, the average change in muscle size, at least what I've seen in my lab and across a lot of studies, is fractions of a centimeter, and we're measuring it with ultrasound. And if you get zero point 0.2 centimeters of growth and you get 0.22 centimeters of growth in your other group, 0.22 versus zero point 0.2, that's within the cursor of my mouse. Like I literally cannot measure that. So maybe it's a little bit better, but I would never be able to tell you that with the tools that I have and the skill level that I have and the sample size that I'm able to recruit. So a lot of studies in my mind are kind of designed to fail because there might be a difference, but I don't think most studies can actually detect the difference. Now, sometimes they do, and sometimes the difference is just too impressive for at least for my liking or for something I find believable. And that's something I talk about a lot. Why was this group so much better than this group with such a small difference? And in those cases, I tend to think it's measurement error or some confounding factor that impacted their measurement. Because often you'll read research and you'll be like, okay, what did they do differently? And there's no reason to really expect a difference. And then the study will have this crazy change in one group and not a crazy change in the other. And it's like, well, that makes no sense to me. I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and I can't remember the author's name, but we were reviewing a paper, and in this paper they had a 1 set, 3 set, and 5 set group, and it's not the Schoenfeld volume study, but it's a study that they were replicating. If you look at the original study and you look at the triceps, 3 sets per exercise per session yielded no growth. It was like zero point zero 0.08. And then when you went up to 5 sets per exercise per session, all of a sudden you had a ton of growth. It's like, well, that makes no sense, right? It makes no sense that these 2 extra sets bring you from nothing to a really robust response. And in a lot of studies, you'll see these kind of peculiar findings, at least what I find peculiar,
Yeah.
in that the finding doesn't seem plausible. Therefore, I question the measurement to some
Mm.
extent, right? Or was the finding driven by the fact that maybe just 2 or 3 people in this group had swelling, or there was something went wrong with their measurement and it was way larger than it should have been? But in general, detecting differences between interventions, I believe, is difficult because we're good at measuring growth or no growth. We're less good at at measuring this growth was a little bit better than that growth. And in 8 to 12 weeks, you're typically only going to get a small difference, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So to finalize, how should someone take the results of a study?
I think the results of individual studies need to be taken with a grain of salt. You could really like a study and you could say, I think they're onto something here, right? But I approach most studies with this is interesting. I'd love to see it replicated. I'd love to see what other labs find. For example, the newspaper that just came out, the single set study, it's a preprint, so it hasn't been peer reviewed.
Hmm.
But in the preprint, they did one set per exercise. And if you focus on the quads, they did 3 exercises for the quads and they did it twice a week. So that's 6 sets of quad work per week. And it's an 8-week study. Within the study, one group went to failure and the other group trained with 2 reps in reserve.
Hmm. I saw that.
So I've seen all types of different interpretations of this paper. One interpretation I've seen is that all you need to do is 1 set per exercise. Maybe that's true, but you have to keep in mind that that study didn't include comparison groups. There was no high volume group in that paper, so you can't make that conclusion. 2 IR versus failure. In some cases, it looks like the failure was way better than the 2 IRR, 2 reps in reserve group.
Hmm.
But the failure group had motivation, like they encouraged them. The 2 reps in reserve didn't. They got no verbal encouragement. So there's actually more differences than what it looks like on the surface. There's 2 things that were different. The verbal encouragement was different, and the repetitions to failure was different. But when I read that paper, for me, I say, okay, the difference between these groups, despite only being a 2 rep difference per exercise, is really impressive. And then when I look at the growth overall, the growth is also really impressive. Like the growth in that paper is better than 24 weekly sets in some other research studies. Now you have to be careful when you compare across studies because labs do things differently. But there has to be some objective way to look at data and determine how compelling is this data. And as a field, I don't think we're there yet. I think we're having the discussion a little bit more. And I think just because people do things differently doesn't mean that we use the excuse that we can never actually critique how much growth was observed in studies. And that's something that I'm really interested in doing. You know, 1 set yielded 0.37 centimeters of growth in the mid thigh. Well, that's more growth than 80 to 90% of studies that I'm aware of, and they got it with 6 sets. So does that mean that 6 sets is really effective, or does that mean that their error of their measurement was a little bit high
Mm.
and they needed a control group to actually give us a good interpretation of their findings? And maybe if they had a control group, maybe we would have been less compelled overall on their study findings, right? So what will happen with this study inevitably is people will take it to support what they want, the conclusion to be, when holistically you need to say, this is interesting. I think this paper could be interpreted this way. But in the grand scheme, we need more data, we need more research, and we need to, look across all of these studies to try to get a picture of what's accurate. But that's not really what happens because a paper comes out and we forget everything else and we run with the current thing that everyone's talking about. And that happens so often. At least I've seen that happen very often.
Thank you very much for clarifying this because this is important, especially for people who follow and talk about strategy findings. And we saw many people trying to push things that were really like very, it's almost impossible to see the difference.
Yeah.
And they made like a whole system about it. And, uh, to me, it didn't make sense. And I read some of the stuff you put about this and watched the videos, and it made sense to me, which is why also I wanted to talk to you. So people need to understand like how you you have to be aware of the factors and how that study was, and the result.
Yeah. If I
What?
could add, it's
Yeah, sure,
it's
sure. Yeah.
it's kind of the nature of what science is becoming with with social media. When I published a study, some of my papers, I'm like, I hope this doesn't get a lot of traction on social media because it's just one study, and I want this to be very cautiously interpreted. You know, and I'm with that with my own research, even if I'm really into it, and I think, oh, this is really cool. I really think this finding is impactful. I want to see other people find a similar thing. And and then I'm still going to be cautious when I tell people we found this. Maybe it's for this reason or that reason. I think it's because of this reason. And the opposite happens on social media. So on social media, a lot of the scientists are now kind of influencers, and they need content and they need clicks and they need to get a lot of traffic. So the opposite is happening where instead of cautiously saying, hey, here's some new data to consider in the conversation of this issue, instead of doing that, they're using the research as this new thing. You got to try it. If you don't do this, you're getting 80% less gains than what you could be getting. And that's just it's just a strange way to use science, in my opinion. It's kind of using science as this prop that can support things and kind of hold up a business model, but it's not good use of science, in my opinion. I don't necessarily think it's intentional, but it's definitely happening. And I do think the scientific community is becoming more aware of this
Mhm.
and seeing it as more of an issue than it's been perhaps in the previous decade.
For sure, for sure. And as you said earlier, like you were asked to run some tests using specific exercises, you know, even
Yeah.
though you're not agreeing with. But some people like trying to push stuff because, as you said, they need to create content, and therefore, like they are building almost a business about that, especially with the results, and which is very hard to be 100% sure.
Yeah.
What takes longer to recover, muscle or tendons and joints?
I think connective tissue, definitely due to the how it has lower vasculature, which I if we're talking about injury to connective tissue, I think that certainly takes longer. If we're talking about the trauma from resistance
Yeah,
training,
from resistance training.
I think we're probably creating more trauma within the fiber than the connective tissue, but you can certainly do both, right? And I've had discussions with people because they'll talk about the fatigue load that you get from low load training because you are more fatigued, right? If you get to the point where you can't lift 10 pounds, you're considerably more fatigued than when you get to the point where you can't lift 20 pounds, right?
Yeah.
Because when you reach failure with 20 pounds, you could pick up 10 pounds and still lift it. But when you start with lightweight and you get to that point of fatigue, you're more fatigued. I think overall the muscle has a robust ability to adapt and to respond. And as I was talking with somebody yesterday, and they said, well, the fatigue you accumulate with low load training, it's just not worth it. And I get where they're coming from. Maybe it's not something you want to employ on every single exercise
Hmm.
because the time course of events might be a little bit different. But if you look at studies over 8 to 12 weeks, most people are able to handle, excuse me, both high load training and low load training. And they have different, I think, benefits and trade offs. You might feel more swelling and inflammation when you do a really high rep, low load training protocol. But with a higher weight, lower rep protocol, you might have more tendon soreness. So, like, that's a trade off, right? One's putting more stress on your connective tissue, and one might be causing more inflammation in the days after training. And I think we can recover from both of these things. And I think we can continue to progress through a training block using both of these methods. So I think for a lot of people, it's a question of what is your tendon health? Do you
Yeah.
have any connective tissue issues? For certain movements, you might choose the more fatigue from low load training than the more stress on the tendons from high load training. And then other exercises, you might have really healthy joints and have the confidence to, you know what, for this, I'm going to lift heavier, knowing that the growth is going to be similar, and that your personal recovery due to your health, this loading strategy might be more efficient for you.
Hmm.
So that's kind of how I view it.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of fear with low load training, due to fatigue, and the from what I'm aware of, the fatigue is acute. We've measured the acute fatigue and even the days following low load and high load training, and you get this greater depression with low load training. But it's always made sense to me because you've just fatigued more of the musculature. But then when you look at the recovery, 24, 48 hours later, they look pretty similar. So our ability to recover in the days following, is pretty robust, and especially across a training block, it's going to get better and better. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at with muscle versus connective tissue, but that's
Yeah.
where my mind went: high load versus low load training.
Yeah, but also about muscle grouping. The reason I asked you about that because we recommend in our program for recovery, for better recovery, because I experienced this myself, that work in opposing muscle group that are operated by the same joint seem to show like better recovery. So like because let's say if I work my biceps and triceps in the same day, I feel like I could recover better than working my triceps with chest and
Okay.
shoulders,
Yeah.
So opposing muscle operated by the same joint seem to me like more efficient in terms of recovery, especially for athletes. For example, recovery is important, or
Hmm.
someone also hypertrophy, whose goal is hypertrophy. The faster you recover, the I think it yields more growth. So because you will be able to also work more frequently.
Yeah. Well, not just more growth, but probably more health, right?
Yeah,
So if
more
you're
health
if
as
you're
well.
if you're limiting the number of exposures per week to that joint, that might be of benefit to some individuals. When we were in our teens and 20s, it probably didn't matter. But as I've gotten older, I
True.
definitely appreciate, paying attention to the exposure that I get from my connective tissue. So I do like that approach. I see why, you've had success with that. I think it makes a lot of sense that, okay, I can avoid stressing this joint 5 times a week. I can only stress it 2 or 3 times a week, if I pay attention to how I arrange my exercises. So that does make sense to me. And I think the loading aspect could be another consideration because low load and high load, would also place differential stress on the connective tissue. So I think maybe both those layers are helpful in considering connective tissue versus muscle tissue.
I want to talk to you about hormonal response because sometimes people say like there are some exercises like the squat, for example, deadlift, cause higher hormonal response and produce like more growth hormone, you know,
Yeah.
uh, and anabolic, as if you're taking a shot of anabolic steroids or growth hormone. So, are there specific exercises that you're aware of that stimulate this effect? And how does the rise of cortisol levels counterbalance the hormonal response during high stress activity like squat and deadlift?
Yeah. So I think this hypothesis was kind of dominant in the 90s, probably even the early 2000s. And in 2009, Stu Phillips' lab up in McMaster in Canada, they did a series of studies that were really cool. And one of their study designs, which I always thought was neat, they had one group train their arms, just do bicep curls, and they had the other group do a bunch of leg press to increase circulating hormones, and then they trained their arms. So one group was training their arms with higher hormones in the blood, and the other group was training their arms with low hormones in the blood. And the idea here is when you stress a larger muscle group, you get a greater hormonal response, so greater circulating hormones. And ultimately, what they found was that increasing the circulating hormones had no impact on bicep growth. So, what that kind of demonstrated is that muscle growth is local and it's not systemic. So, you could increase systemic hormones in circulation, but it doesn't seem to have a bearing on muscle growth, the local muscle growth response. They kind of followed this up with some other studies as well, and that kind of led to the high load and low load training literature, because when you lift heavy, you get this hormonal response. You get these spikes in these hormones. When you lift with lighter weights, you're not getting the same hormonal response. And they showed, so they did the leg press bicep study, and then they did the low load high load studies, and in all of these they looked at systemic hormones along with changes in muscle size, and time after time they showed that you could get the same growth without the hormonal response. So the field, as far as I understand, and there's, I think, a few research groups that would still probably disagree with this idea, but the hormonal response is of much less consideration in the context of eliciting muscle growth than it would have been if you sat down with somebody in the year 2000. And I think it's because of those studies that Stu Phillips did, where they showed that the hormonal environment does not have a meaningful impact on the local muscle growth response. And that's why, I think a lot of these isolation movements that target the muscle, maybe they cause less of a hormonal response, but that does not impact their ability to stimulate skeletal muscle growth.
And also there is cortisol also that increases as well. So that counterbalance that hormonal, like the growth hormones.
Oh, okay. So the overall stress response.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure how that impacts recovery, but it probably does impact the time course of recovery a little bit.
Hmm.
And I don't know, you might have more insight on this than I do, and I'd be interested to hear. But overall, as far as the local muscle response, I'm not aware that it does anything meaningful regarding muscle growth.
Dr. Samuel, thank
Uh-huh.
you very much for all the insights today. I really enjoyed this and I was looking forward to this video, and you clarified many things for me. I was able to ask you many questions, and some of the questions were sent to me by some of our members. You know what
Oh,
I
cool.
like one day maybe to run some tests using the Brick 20 exercises, because you said that you use EMG. For us, EMG, this is our, how we think about EMG,
Yeah.
is it doesn't tell you if the exercise is early phase loaded, late phase loaded, if the resistance curve is matching the strength curve of the muscle. But in the case of the Brick 20, I know that it's matching. So using EMG in this case will make a lot of sense, because now it will show that even with complying with the 16 biomechanical factors, now we're using EMG to see in the arc of the motion how much stimulation that muscle is getting. So I think it will be a cool and interesting research to put these exercises into test and compare them to other exercises and see how, like, the degrees of efficiency and muscle loading as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we can definitely talk about maybe come up with a little design to test some things. It'd be
Perfect.
cool.
Where can people find you and learn more about your studies, the latest studies, and
Yeah,
tips?
I guess the social media that I'm most active on is my Instagram, and I gotta double check. I think it's at Samuel Buckner. So my name is pretty simple. Yeah, at Samuel Buckner. I have a ResearchGate profile where you can find my research. I have a Google Scholar profile where people can see, all my publications. They can always email me here at the university if people are interested in education. I think we have a really competitive, really great master's program at the University of South Florida. So I'm always happy to talk to people that have interest in furthering the education. Well, yeah, I post our research, our research and other research as well on Instagram, and I've gotten a little bit better about making posts. I've never been a content creator, but
Same here.
I like posting my thoughts on different studies. And what I will often do is just point things out that people aren't talking about. Like, oh, yeah, this study's interesting, but did you notice this?
Yes,
I think stuff like that's helpful. And it's not to
absolutely.
poke the bear, it's not to cause drama, it's to make people think. I
Mhm.
think you need to think beyond the conclusion sentence in a paper. You need to look at the data. You need to try to understand the data, determine how reasonable is this finding, how realistic is this finding, and those are things that I just really enjoy doing. So if you follow me, I guess you can expect that type of content.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed this video as well. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next video.